I hate war. Like war is horrible, right? Like, I mean, I view myself as anti-war, but like if you're anti-war, if the rational assessment is that avoiding war requires deterring it, which I think is true, and a conservative or realist view of human nature suggests that people will be aggressive if it's in their interest, well, then you have to prepare for war. I mean, it's like, it's one of these cliches, but it's a cliche for a reason. I mean, go back to Washington or the Romans or whatever.
Welcome to Hell Cast. Rediscovering the warrior spirit within. Serious times ahead. But we can do this. We have to. We have to.
Is that there is a portion of the American conservative movement that feels there's too much involvement in Ukraine right now. What are your thoughts on that, and how does that relate to the Chinese threat?
Well, look, I look at this, I start from American interests. What are American interests in the world? American interests in the world are Americans' physical security, our freedom, and our prosperity. And so what is the chief danger of that? Well, by far it's China, and it's China dominating Asia in particular. So first and foremost, we absolutely must take care of the China threat, and in particular, deny it its ability to dominate Asia. We're not doing
this. This is an issue for that where, quote unquote, everyday Americans have a more acute sense because they have felt the impact. It's this like sort of looming omnipresence of like deindustrialization, a loss of control over your economic security. That's the beginning of what's at issue. Today, many of us have different views about the social media companies and their role and what they should do. Essentially, all Americans are assuming that we Americans will be able to work out a solution that we come to. Well, if China is the dominant economy, all those social media companies will either be Chinese or owned or accountable to the Chinese. Structurally, our interest is in having a Russia that, even if it's not allied with the United States, which is probably not going to happen for reasons that are fairly obvious, at least a distance between Russia and China. I mean, it's like the basic, rule of American statecraft should be
don't push China and Russia into a full-scale alliance.
The ultimate morality of our foreign policy should be judged by what I point out as reasonably anticipatable consequences. Like, in a way that's like an investment decision, right? If you give your money for your kid's education and your investor says, but I invested it all in ESG, he's not doing his duty.
So is the goal of American foreign policy, if you were czar tomorrow and controlling this, to make it fundamentally untenable for or undesirable for China to even try to invade?
Exactly.
Or is it to successfully repel them if they did?
Well, the goal is the first. I hate war. Like war is horrible, right? Like, I mean, I view myself as anti-war, but like if you're anti-war, if the rational assessment is that avoiding war requires deterring it, which I think is true, and a conservative or realist view of human nature suggests that people will be aggressive if it's in their interest, well, then you have to prepare for war. I mean, it's like, it's one of these cliches, but it's a cliche for a reason. I mean, go back to Washington or the Romans or whatever. If you want peace, prepare for war, right? So that's what I mean. I just like get really passionate about it because I'm like, man, like we have a freight train coming in, and we still have the time to win. I think tens, maybe hundreds of thousands of Americans will be killed. And the thing is, if we back off, that's not the end of the problem. It's going to keep coming. It's going to get worse. And so that's like, but the way to avoid the war is to be like super laser focused on getting ready for it. And this is like, I mean, Top Gun, it's a little bit of a pop example, but like the original Top Gun movie, I mean, you go back and it's like, movie, 1980s, we got the Soviet Union to collapse without a war. 2 thumbs up. That's what we want. And that's actually not our goal. Our goal is a stable balance of power where our interests have to be respected, just to be clear. But like, that was pretty successful in the 80s. What's the biggest military movie of the 80s about? It's about guys at a training school getting like super ready. At the very tip, it's like, Tom Brady level, like we can't take winning the Super Bowl again for granted. We are going to be super, super, super ready. And if the Chinese see that, because there are big downsides to failure for the Chinese, if they see that they're going to fail, like Mao, I think, they're unlikely to try.
If we want to have an impact
in 5 years, we need to like pull the emergency, door or the emergency bell now. Right. Because you need to act with that degree of urgency to have an impact in 3-5 years.
Our Republican foreign policy should focus on protecting and promoting Americans' physical security, our liberties, and our prosperity and economic security. Now, if we identify the threats to those goods, by far the most dangerous is a very great power that could attack or undermine them. Power is the main thing. Lesser threats, by definition, can be dealt with more easily. And we're here on 9/11. They are as a very real threat, but it is one that we can manage. Now, America is roughly 20% of global GDP, and economic productivity, of course, as Peter Thiel eloquently put it, is the root of power in the modern world. So this means that only a very great state could hope to become so strong as to really menace us. And the only state in the international system that remotely matches up to that description is China. But China on its own is not strong or big enough. It's also, right now, about roughly 20% of global GDP. So how could China pose such a threat to our interests? Well, by dominating Asia.
Well, look, in a way, I think of conservatism and realism as kind of cognate, like they're pretty similar in my conception. I mean, in the sense that I really try to go back and the world, people are not perfectible, large, grandiose social projects are unlikely to pan out well. You're supposed to look after the people closest to you, family, citizenry, etc. That's sort of the basic idea. It's a tough world. It's a competitive place out there. There's a lot of dangers. You got to be realistic about that. And I think, look, we got hubristic. And that was true of the Democrats, but it was also true of the Republicans. I mean, you go back and you look at some of the things, an end to evil. I mean, ending tyranny in the world. I mean, these are things, they might be noble in a certain way, but I think, I've actually got a piece coming out in First Things kind of laying out the sort of moral case from my point of view. I don't think it's moral at the end of the day to do things that are unwise or imprudent. I mean, not to get into religion too much, but, I was in the church earlier this month, and there's Luke 12, and Jesus talking about stewardship. And I think that's the sort of mindset that I bring, that this is not only some sort of cold, heartless, playing on a game board. This is actually what's moral and prudent. And I go back to first principles about what is our foreign policy about. Well, I think it's pretty similar to our domestic policy. It's about the American people's physical security, their freedom, and their prosperity, which are, of course, linked. And that's what I try to build from and to, in a sense, in where I'm laying out my foreign policy. So, as you rightly point out, this could mean heavy engagement abroad, but it might not. And we have to recognize how much power we have and not be delusional about it. And I think there's still a great deal of delusion, and I don't think that's good for the American people.
Look, I have what sounds a little bit like an old-fashioned point of view, but I think it's correct, which is that military power, and particularly decisive, direct military power, is the most determinative force in human life, right? Because, and this is, again, I'm a realist, like the most persuasive form of influence is lethal force, the threat of lethal force, right? I mean, as Thomas Hobbes put it, the passion to be reckoned upon is fear, right? So if you really want to persuade somebody, especially to do something they don't want to do, you can try influence and voodoo and propaganda and stuff, but my basic sense is it tends not to be structurally influential. It can help on the
It's also backed up by the threat of force. And negotiation and diplomacy happens in that context, ultimately.
That's exactly what I'm going to get to, which is diplomacy without force is like a dance without music. Right?
China has enormous goals, and its first, I think, big goal is to dominate Asia. And here are the facts, too. Asia is going to be upwards of 50% of global GDP. And he who dominates over 50% of global GDP is going to dominate our economy, right? And thus our society. So there's this idea that we could just pull back and have autarky at home but that's just not how it's going to work. Because, go back to that realism, go back to that conservative insight that people are not angels. Well, if they've got over 50% of global GDP, what are they going to do with it? And we don't have to speculate because they're already behaving that way. Look at things like TikTok and look how they behave at home. So this is by far the most profound danger that we face, and I just don't see the urgency in our system at all, and that really makes me, frankly, furious.